Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenhead, Jerusalem psychotherapist. This week's Torah and Psychology post of Parshas Naso is going to discuss defining problematic behaviour. Because in Parshas Naso we learn about the Nazir. A Nazir is somebody that takes on certain behavioural restrictions. They don't cut their hair, they avoid becoming impure, and they also avoid drinking any wine. And these behavioural changes can perhaps be seen as extreme. And the question is becoming a Nazir viewed as something positive or negative? And the Netziv explains that these behavioural changes serve a purpose. They elevate the person's life. They refine the person's behaviour so that they can live their life on a higher level of holiness. And this suggests that perhaps being a Nazir is something positive. However, at the end of the Nazirus process, the person brings a korban chatos, a sin offering. And the Ramban explains that because a person brings a korban chatos, it suggests that there's something negative about Nazirus. It suggests that living an elevated life, living a life where a person detaches themselves from normal reality, from the normal way of behaving, is something negative. And that a person shouldn't necessarily do that. Behavioral extremes are not necessarily looked upon favourably. But we can say that Nazirus serves a purpose. It's intentional behaviour. It's desirable to the person. It's not causing any harm or distress. And therefore, we wouldn't necessarily define this behaviour of Nazirus as problematic. And this can apply to psychology. How do we define behaviour as being problematic? So we have the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, and this gives a clear guideline of how to view behaviour that will be seen as clinically problematic. And although it is definitely a useful tool within therapy and psychiatric diagnosis, perhaps it misses the individual and personal aspect, the subjective experience of the person. A person's behaviour might not be problematic if they themselves view it as serving a purpose, something which is intentional and is not causing them any harm or distress, as we have seen perhaps with a Nazir. So we shouldn't necessarily rush to conclusions and say that extreme behaviour that deviates from the norm is problematic. We should look at the person, look at the subjective experience, and see how they experience it, how they relate to it, and ask, when we are assessing a person's behaviour, ask ourselves the question: is it problematic to this person? If no, then perhaps we shouldn't give them be so quick to judge and give them a diagnosis of behaving in a problematic way. And this teaches a message of tolerance. Yes, there are social, cultural and religious norms, and it serves a purpose. It's important to have a normal standard. But if a person deviates from this and behaves in a slightly different way, perhaps what we would say is extreme, we shouldn't necessarily say that it is problematic behaviour, and we should be able to view it in a more tolerant way. Have a great Shabbos and keep well.